Hi, I'm John DeDakis. I'm a novelist, a writing coach, a manuscript editor, and a former editor on CNN's The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. You're one-to-one with me, and I'm one-to-one with the QAnon phenomenon. QAnon started several years ago in October, I think, of 2017 in the dark recesses, corners of the internet. But its delusional conspiracy theories have now mushroomed to the point where they've infiltrated mainstream political discourse. Uh, so there's a book now out that explains what QAnon is all about, and we are going to talk with the authors shortly. First, let me put the book on the screen so that you can see it. We'll take a look at it full screen, and let me explain a little bit about this book. It's entitled "Pastels and Pedophiles Inside the Mind of QAnon." It's written by Mia Bloom and Sophia Moskalenko. And today on One-to-One, we're going to meet the authors and to go in depth. Their book explains just what QAnon is, how it got its start, how it spread, and perhaps most importantly, how you might be able to understand or even help a family member or friend who's gone down the rabbit hole of QAnon delusions. So first, let's introduce you to the authors one by one. Let me get rid of the book here, and we're going to add to the stream. This is Mia Bloom. Mia, welcome. Dr. Bloom has a Ph.D. in political science, Middle East international relations, and comparative politics from Columbia University. She is an international security fellow at New America and professor of communication at Middle East Studies at Georgia State University in Atlanta. She is considered to be one of the world's leading experts on violence and extremism. Dr. Bloom, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And now let me add to the stream your co-author. Let's take a look at Sophia Moskalenko. Her PhD is in social and clinical psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. She's a program management specialist at the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism's Behavioral Insights Hub. Her research focuses on radicalization, self-sacrifice, martyrdom, and disinformation. She's worked on projects for the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Homeland Security, State Department, plus she serves as a consultant to the European Commission, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and Georgia State University's Cybersecurity Unit. So Dr. Moskalenko, welcome to you too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let's see if we can get everybody in here, because first, let me start with you, Mia. And I know you both have doctorates. I don't, so I'm incredibly impressed already. But I hope you don't mind if I call you Mia and Sophia. But I'm certainly impressed with your credentials. Mia, let me ask you first, and Sophia, if you want to follow up on this. Is it safe to assume that people who aren't even involved in the QAnon movement, that they can be unwittingly parroting QAnon conspiracy theories without even realizing that that's where they come from?
It's very possible that can happen, in part because some of the QAnon main themes have seeped into Fox News, Newsmax. And, when you're talking about that the Democrats are blood-drinking pedophiles, or you're talking about Jewish space lasers, and you're perpetuating some of these QAnon main themes, people may not realize it's QAnon. If you're talking about certain anti-Semitic tropes, racist tropes, homophobic and anti-transphobe, like these tropes are all part of QAnon without necessarily realizing it, because now it's become not just the 20 in Congress who are opposing Kevin McCarthy, but it's becoming very mainstream. You'll hear it on Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham and not realize that, wait a second, that's QAnon.
Do they realize it's QAnon?
I absolutely have to think, as much as I may not like them, that they're not idiots. Or if they're idiots, at least their EPs and the people around them who are writing the copy that they read know what's going on. And so I think in many ways, we have to understand the main part of QAnon is also that it's kind of a Russian psychological operation. And they become unwitting or even witting, useful idiots, as Putin would call them.
Whoa. Well, I want to talk about the Russian angle. Sophia, what is QAnon? How would you define it?
Um, I would say for our book and for our research, we talk of QAnon as an online collective, almost a social movement that centers online around a collection of all kinds of conspiracy theories. The major one of which is that there is a cabal of Satan worshipping pedophiles who kidnap and torture children to harvest their blood in order to get this hormone they call adrenochrome, which is supposed to give them some sort of special powers. And that this cabal includes members of the American political elite, specifically Democrats like Bill and Hillary Clinton, but also multi-billionaires like Bill Gates and Hollywood, A-listers like Bill Hanks and Lady Gaga, and even the Pope. So that's their like main narrative. And then the flip side of that is that secretly behind the scenes, Donald Trump is fighting to take down the cabal and have them all publicly executed and to restore America and the world to some sort of former glory that we've all kind of missed by accident.
Here's the thing. I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, this is just nuts. And yet there are some very intelligent people who really buy into this. How did this happen? How did it happen? Mia, can you explain that to me?
We tried to explain in the book how, this fringe movement that starts on 4chan and then it moves to 8chan and then later 8kun sort of seeped into this general consciousness across all the different social media platforms. And I think part of it is, at least at the outset, it was gamified in such a way, like Pokemon, got to catch them all. It created a game like structure for people thinking that they were doing their own research to find these clues. And since Sophia is a psychologist, she explains in the book how people, figuring out the clues, there's actually a physiological, dopamine benefit, this hit in the brain that you get, like, oh, aren't you so clever? You figured it out. And so I think that part of it was the way in which it manipulated people into feeling good about themselves, into giving them something that could explain, we were in a once in a century pandemic and there were a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. And so what QAnon offered people was a way of explaining everything that we didn't understand. And it made people feel a little bit better about the world. But of course, it was all a lie. And we talk about the fact that, this isn't just a low information voter phenomenon. There were people who were professionals. There were people who might even have been in the medical field. Or, there was one woman who was interviewed by the New York Times. She has a master's degree from Harvard, my alma mater. So she can't be dumb. But I think dumb and naive are not the same thing.
And so how did it actually get started? I mean, it's relatively new phenomenon, 2017, right?
Relatively. In October of 2017, on one of these internet chat, this platform called 4chan, which is kind of the underbelly of the internet, there was this very interesting clue that was dropped that Hillary Clinton was about to be arrested. And of course she wasn't. And this led to over 4,900 different of these Q drops. And the Q drops were very often couched in a riddle, or you had to figure it out. And from there, it moved from 4chan to more open API platforms like Facebook and Twitter, YouTube. But I think what we show in the book is that the interest in QAnon was relatively flat until the pandemic. And then in March in 2020, we have a 600% increase in postings and people who are consuming the content. And you cannot divorce the appreciation of QAnon and its metastasis from what was going on with the lockdowns and the pandemic and all of that anxiety that it caused.
Sophia, could you explain why the book is entitled Pastels and Pedophiles?
Well, pastels refers to the softer side of QAnon that permeated, Instagram yoga posts and essential oils, and these helicopter moms picked up QAnon's ideas about kidnapped and tortured children, and collectively became what is known as the pastel QAnon. And of course, the pedophiles refers to this idea of QAnons of the cabal who kidnaps and tortures and sexually abuses children.
And women are, there's a line from the book. Let me just women, you write, women have been at the forefront of white racist movements for the past 100 years. And you also write, the vast majority of terrorist groups fail within the first 2 years, but groups that recruit women guarantee the entire family will be indoctrinated. The best way to access the kids is to recruit the moms. And that was stunning to me, that so much of QAnon is populated by women. Why is that? That's a jump ball. Either of you can chime in on that one.
Well, part of what inspired us is, Sophia and I have both been individually working on issues of terrorism for 3 decades. And I think that we initially approached QAnon much like Christopher Wray of the FBI, and more recently, Alejandro Mayorkas and even Merrick Garland, that it had potential for terrorism. And so we were looking for terrorism because we know lots about terrorism. And we also know a lot about women in terrorism. And what was so interesting is that there were elements of QAnon that shared quite a bit of commonality with, for example, ISIS recruitment. But then there were some very important differences in terms of the size of QAnon, that it was much more, like Sophia says, of a social movement and not any kind of terrorist organization with a hierarchical structure or even any kind of structure. But I think it's important that we understand that the role that women are playing, whether it's in terms of the election of very conservative Republicans or even Republicans that are spouting QAnon content, has been really crucial when we look at white women voting in 2016 and in 2020. Actually, the number of white suburban Republican women that voted for Donald Trump increased, despite the fact that all of this information has come out about Donald Trump. So in fact, we shouldn't be surprised that in terms of maintaining the existing hierarchies in some places of masculine superiority, misogyny, and racism, women are very often colluding, and they are promoting and upholding these systems that ultimately oppress them.
Sophia, what's the psychological component to this? Why are women so attracted to QAnon?
I think we have to be careful to not speak of all women. I think QAnon is largely a white suburban woman phenomenon, and that in itself might be the beginning of an explanation for why these particular women are attracted to it. And some of it has to do with the shifting gender roles and expectations for women that have in the recent decades begun to include things like college degree and a career, while at the same time in this country, women still bear the brunt of housework and childcare. And so it's a double whammy for a lot of women, especially women who grew up with the idea of this little house on the prairie where, there's a single earner household. The man goes out and earns the money and the woman stays home in her little apron and cooks dinner and raises kids. And that life in their lifetime became kind of unattainable. Single earner household are a thing of the past mostly. we now need two incomes to maintain that beautiful house, and women got stuck with doing both the formerly men's jobs, earning money, and also the still very much women's jobs of raising children and taking care of the house. And, especially women who are white and suburban, are not necessarily very happy with these developments. And for them, in addition to this burden that is placed on them with the shifting gender norms, the idea of LGBTQ people becoming a legitimate part of the society, gay couples being able to adopt children, transgender people, that's also chipping away at things that formerly used to hold a very solid place in their view of the world. And this is altogether adding up to what psychologists call unfreezing, which is a very unpleasant state when what you thought you knew is no longer true, and the new reality has not yet solidified. And people in this unfrozen state are very, very vulnerable to radicalization of any kind. They just seek, an alternative to the reality that is highly unpleasant to them. And during COVID lockdowns, when we were all isolated and the computer became, for many of us, the only window into the world, QAnon offered this alternative reality that, gave them an explanation for why things weren't the way they wanted them, and also promised that they were going to go back to that, idealized version of America that they really wanted for themselves and couldn't have.
How is it that QAnon became more mainstream? Because it was in the dark recesses of the internet, and now it's, the QAnon conspiracy theories are they're in Congress. How did that happen?
It's worse than that. Roku launched a channel apparently a few days ago that is basically a QAnon content channel. And despite the fact that this channel is violating Roku's terms of service, it has become so mainstream. We're seeing, these are not Hollywood movies, but we're seeing B-list Hollywood actors acting in films in order to spread the QAnon message. And Roku has this dedicated channel. There in Germany, for example, there's a literary magazine that is basically QAnon content, despite the fact that so much of QAnon is anti-Semitic and technically illegal in Germany. So I think we're seeing it jumped the shark, so to speak, around 2019, 2020, with the introduction of the Save the Children campaign. QAnon became very popular, and that's where it's no longer exclusively a right-wing phenomenon. We're seeing it also, as Sophia said, with the far left, the vegans, the essential oils, the breastfeeding, the mom's timeline, and the yoga on Instagram. So it's important that we understand that. But I wanted to just add, the quote that you read partly reflects the work of Evian Leidig and Saywood Darby, who talk about these trad wives. And we've been seeing this young generation of women in their early to mid 20s on Instagram, and they are very much promoting the right-wing agenda of being a traditional wife, but also that their lifestyle is something to be, desired and emulated. And so we're seeing that wrapped up with QAnon. So many of these QAnon women, some of whom have left and now they do interviews like Melissa Rain Lively, they fit this very stereotypical, the blonde and the contoured face and the designer clothes, like this very much this Instagram phenomenon of what we need to look like, what we want to look like, who we want to be. And you see this almost reflected in the family of Donald Trump. The women in Donald Trump's family also look this way. It's a particular kind of look that the women are aspiring to, as well as a lifestyle.
Let's talk. You mentioned earlier about about Russia's involvement, and one of the things that was striking in your book is how Russia pretty much made it a full-time job to seed a lot of those QAnon conspiracy theories in U.S. social media. Talk about that a little bit.
You want to take that? That's your
is that
yeah.
is that Mia's area of
Yeah.
expertise? Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to start, but Sophia's actually looked at this content in Russian, so I definitely want to, have her jump in. I think what happens is that very much, and I've seen on social media recently when you're looking at some of the posts by the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, that was involved with Cambridge Analytica in 2016, side by side with QAnon posts, and they're verbatim. Like, in other words, this message ultimately that is a Russian message. When you had Tracy Beans and others starting out in 2017, a lot of the individual influencers that promoted QAnon content and disseminated the content were either Russian bots or actually Russian agents in Russia online pretending to be Americans. And so for us, what was interesting is that Russia amplified and promoted QAnon. And now, of course, Russia has its own QAnon problem. But it is very much along the lines of Russia's plan to foster, disunion in the United States, to undermine democracy. What we're seeing in Washington for the last 3 days, going on 4 days, where that is ultimately the goal. Because what Russia does with QAnon is it makes you question the validity of elections. It makes you question the authority of the individuals who've been voted in. And so this questioning everything is ultimately at Russia's benefit.
Now, Sophia, do you have a Russian background? You speak Russian.
I'm Ukrainian, so
okay.
I grew up in the Soviet Union where we had to speak Russian, and yes, of course I do. I wanted to add to what Mia said that we have data on this. This is now indisputable that Russia did engage in promoting QAnon content. We don't know whether Russia stood at the kind of beginning of this Q drop person or persons, if those people were somehow connected with Russia or sponsored by Russia. But we do know that Russia engaged very heavily in the promotion of the content once it started gaining popularity. And Russia was not the only one. We also have data that China did that, and even Iran joined in promoting QAnon content during COVID lockdowns. And as we say in the book, Mia mentioned, we started out thinking about QAnon as potentially a terrorist group. And through our research and a lot of thinking about it, we came to see it as not a terrorist threat. But that's not to say that we don't see it as a threat. We just see it as a different kind of threat. Namely, it's a threat to the stability of the social fabric of the United States. It's a long game by those governments and countries that promoted content to destabilize our institutions, our democracy, to shake our trust in our government, to create, these alternative movements and beliefs that at the end undermine our way of life and can be, if anything, possibly even more damaging than a terrorist attack. Because what a terrorist attack does inevitably is it unifies the people, the country that is attacked. What QAnon does is just the opposite. It breaks us apart.
Mia, what role did QAnon have in the January 6th insurrection? And incidentally, we are live on the second anniversary of the attack on the Capitol. And in fact, as you alluded to, the Congress and the House right now, 20 hard right conservative Republicans are holding up the election of the Speaker of the House. And it's basically the tail wagging the dog right now. And I guess it's sort of a two-pronged question that perhaps both of you will be able to weigh in on. But Mia first, the role QAnon had in January 6th, and among those 20 far-right Congress people in the House, how many of them are actually QAnon?
I think that people assumed, and this might be where Alejandro Mayorkas and Merrick Garland and others were very concerned about QAnon as a movement. And we had, for example, before our book came out, the Sufan group came out with their own assessment. And, you know, we have to, with all due respect, if these surveys that have been done by the American Enterprises Institute or the Institute for the Study of Religion are representative samples, we're looking at as many as 30 million US adults that believe in QAnon. So I'm going to actually say that I hope it's not a terrorist movement, because there's never been a terrorist group that's had millions of believers. But I think that, you know, when you looked at what happened 2 years ago on this day on Capitol Hill, and at this time they were just, you know, starting to clean up the mess of everything, including people who had, you know, desecrated the Capitol with defecation and urine and everything else. But I think that the QAnon people stood out because, like Waldo, right? They're wearing a giant Q on their shirt, and or they're painting their face and wearing horns and their bare chest with tattoos like Jacob Chansley. So I think that there might have been an assumption that this was exclusively a QAnon event, when in fact it was a number of right-wing extremist groups that coalesced, and the QAnon folks seem to have bulked out the crowd. But certainly QAnon was crucial for organizing, you know, getting people on the buses, getting them to DC, organizing and getting people all riled up. Because of course the QAnon message is, it's not just, you know, I have one view of politics and you have another, and we can meet somewhere in the middle in a compromise, but you're a blood drinking pedophile vampire, and so you're evil. There's no negotiation or meeting halfway when the other side is being framed as evil. The last question is your second question about how many. Well, we know, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert for sure, but also people like Andy Biggs. I mean, there's a number of the 20 who have, if not promoted QAnon content outright, very obviously, then, you know, people like Matt Gaetz, who use it instrumentally, which of course in Matt Gaetz's example is so ironic given his own personal proclivities for underage girls.
Well,
so,
we don't know for sure that that's the case because it has not been adjudicated yet.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Let's
Captain
be careful
Venmo,
there.
allegedly.
But still, it is ironic. And it is with Trump as well, considering all of the issues he's had with women. That doesn't seem to be a problem with QAnon, which means it doesn't really make any kind of logical sense, which is why it's delusional, I guess.
It's further problematic because among those 20 that are blocking Kevin McCarthy from being speaker, many of them who are talking about child trafficking all the time actually blocked a motion to do something about child trafficking that was raised in the last Congress, you know, when the Democrats were still in the majority. And so there's absolutely no consistency in terms of what they say is important to them, you know, to their movement or to them personally, and then their actions.
Sophia, let me ask you this. January 6th was arguably it was a watershed event. And I would imagine that it was a watershed event for the advocates of QAnon. And a lot of the things that they were predicting didn't happen. So what effect did January 6th have on and the ultimate election and certification and inauguration of Joe Biden? What effect did that have on the psychology of the QAnon true believers?
Yeah, it's a great question. So they did believe before January 6th that there was going to be the storm, that's the term they use, that was going to sweep through Washington, D.C. You know, the cabal would be hanged. They built the gallows in front of the Capitol Hill building, presumably for the hanging of the cabal members. And that Donald Trump was going to be reinstated as legitimate president of the United States. And then very clearly that didn't happen. Now, we have to be careful here because, as Mia mentioned, we're talking about possibly tens of millions of adults in the United States believing some part of QAnon folklore. And we don't know that what we saw online as the outcome of these non-events represent the entire QAnon phenomenon. But what we did see was that there was a lot of confusion and dismay and kind of a crisis for true believers who, went online and shared with each other their just complete loss at how is it possible they fully expected these things to materialize, and yet they haven't. And what does it mean for QAnon as a whole? Some of them said, well, maybe they were lied to this whole time. Some of them went right away looking for other radical views of the world and the future, and were quickly picked up by right-wing groups such as Proud Boys or Oath Keepers, who capitalized on this state of confusion and dismay that some QAnon followers experienced in order to engage them and bring them into their own realm. And so in the book, we suggest that, after January 6th, QAnon fell into these three brackets. There were kind of true believers that stayed true. There were those who we called diehards. So, they believed that even though it looked like Donald Trump didn't become president, he actually did become president. And there were a number of ways that they concocted to justify this belief. So they said that maybe Joe Biden was actually not Joe Biden, that it was Donald Trump wearing a bodysuit of Joe Biden. Or alternatively, that, in fact, Donald Trump was inaugurated as president, and it was, true ceremony on January 20th. Meanwhile, what everybody saw on TV was just staged, previously recorded. And in fact, they claimed, if you look closely, you'll see that, what Joe Biden holds his hand over is not the real Bible, is some other book that just looks like a Bible. And they even pointed out the fact that the number of American flags at the inauguration numbered at, I think, 17. And number 17 is important because that's the number in the alphabet that letter Q takes. And so isn't that a sign that the inauguration was actually staged, and in fact, everything went according to plan? So these are the diehards. There were also these doubters that, at least for a while, expressed this idea that maybe this was all not quite true. Maybe we were misled. Maybe, there was some manipulation that was taking place. And some of them ended up going to the right-wing groups, and maybe some of them ended up believing these stories concocted by the diehards. And finally, there were defectors, people who realized, like, this could not have possibly been what we thought it was. And so they just left QAnon and never looked back. We cannot really put numbers on those groups. We have very anecdotal evidence, people, that we saw acting online, or who then came out and gave interviews to newspapers and magazines. But what did happen, and I think not just with January 6th, but also with these highly publicized trials of participants of January 6th, was that QAnon became a little bit of a toxic phenomenon. So in one of the large surveys that Mia and I have conducted, we asked people about their beliefs in 8 different QAnon conspiracies. And we also asked them whether they consider themselves to be QAnon. And you would expect that there would be almost 100% overlap between those who express strong beliefs for all 8 conspiracies and those who call themselves Q. And in fact, we find that less than 50% of those participants who endorse all 8 conspiracies are willing to call themselves QAnon. So at least on the surface, they might still believe all that stuff about the cabal and lizard people and space lasers. But if you ask them about QAnon, they will be like, no, not me, never,
So, and how do you explain that?
Well, I think, it's not fun being on the receiving end of a lot of political fallout from this very salient, very publicized event. And, even people who didn't really care one way or another about QAnon after January 6th may have had a very strong opinion. And of course, QAnon followers live among us. They are neighbors and friends and colleagues. And hearing people talk about January 6th and QAnon in these very negative terms probably caused them to rethink how openly they want to affiliate themselves with this.
So here's my question then. For those of us in the, I don't know, the sane real life world, how can we discern if a person doesn't identify with QAnon, but still spouts their conspiracy theories? What are the red flags, the rhetorical red flags that will help those of us who aren't cued in, so to speak, on Q? What are the red flags that will help us to identify Q thinking, conspiracy theory rhetoric?
I don't know if self-identification is necessarily a necessary, like, is it necessarily a prerequisite to dealing with someone who believes these things? For example, uh, a lot of people who are jihadis, if you ask them, are you a jihadi? Don't say you're a jihadi. So there is a certain amount of dissimulation for any of these groups, especially, when QAnon was being deplatformed in the summer of 2020, sort of in the fall, in the lead up, let's say, to the election. I think QAnon actually told its supporters, don't say QAnon. So I think it's very important, Sophia, as a psychologist, knows that you want to ask the right questions. If people believe in all of the 8 conspiracies associated with QAnon, but don't self-identify, that's like, your cousin who drinks too much, but doesn't consider himself an alcoholic.
Right.
You look at the behavior, you look at the belief system, you look at whether or not they're acting on it, and the self-identification is less necessary. And I think it's one of the reasons Sophia, for example, suggested as a treatment mindfulness, MBSR, because you don't have to go to like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and say, hi, my name is so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic. You don't have to own it. But I think we also have to realize that, a person who's a Proud Boy isn't going to identify as a Proud Boy. A person who's a neo-Nazi, probably, among certain groups, they'll be advertising it, but other people, they'll hide it. So the idea that you don't self-identify isn't always a problem with these groups that are very problematic.
Is one of the tenets of the QAnon conspiracies the big lie that Donald Trump is still the president? That's one of the big lies.
Absolutely. And, what we saw, for example, because we were following it through the election, what we saw a few months after the election, they stopped talking about Stop the Steal, and they started talking about this sort of crazy anti-LGBTQ platform where they started talking about trans people. Was it Storytime Hour? They were talking about controlling the content of K through 12 education, running for school boards. So in other words, there was a shift, a noticeable shift within the QAnon discussion groups and on their platforms to stop talking about Stop the Steal. And now let's talk about, getting our country back and pivoting on certain wedge issues, the trans issue being one of them, but also even things like immigration, because for them, immigration is the mechanism through which we have the trafficking occurring.
Sophia, anything you want to add to what Mia is saying so far?
Yeah, I think just to put it another way, what Mia said is they went for big politics. They kind of crashed and burned a little bit, and they decided that maybe this wasn't the winning ticket. Maybe the small grassroots campaigns, local elections, library boards, school boards were a way to go. And in some ways, it may be more of a problem, for us in the long term than, when they were coalescing around this one event and we could see it in real time and, real forces could be dispersed to control it or prevent it. It's not like that with these smaller, all over the country little campaigns.
The implication or the inference that I get from what you're saying is almost as if QAnon itself is sort of shape shifting, and that it's not necessarily abating. Would you say it's intensifying?
Certainly in the lead up to the 2022 elections, for the midterms, what we saw was that the QAnon groups were getting almost an adrenaline shot in the arm, partly because in the 3 months leading up to the midterms, Donald Trump who had, sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge with QAnon. He had never fully embraced them. In the 3 months prior to the midterms, he fully embraced them. He started wearing a Q lapel pin. He started referring to himself as Q plus, which is how they referred to him. He started on Truth Social, so re-truthing QAnon memes about the storm and about QAnon. So I think that a lot of the people who might have been in the aftermath of January 6th a little depressed that the predictions did not come true, all of a sudden now feel, wait a second, he's back and he's with us. And part of it might have been that the QAnon folks are going to be Donald Trump's most loyal supporters. And when he's feeling isolated, or if he's feeling that he's losing Republican, sort of mainstream Republican support, which we've seen when when he was nominated to be Speaker of the House by Matt Gaetz, from what I understand, he only got the one vote.
Only
which
one
means
vote.
that not anyone in the room other than Matt Gaetz voted for him. And you know that he was not going to be happy about that. So I think he feels that, he wraps the QAnon support around him, like a weighted blanket. He's like an anxious individual, and he really just drinks in their love and admiration. And they have elevated him to martyr-like status. So for him, it's, Jesus and Trump, and he is sort of the second or the third coming, depending how you count. But it is really interesting to see that, whereas at least people around Trump up throughout his presidency from 2017 until he left office, they never wanted him to fully embrace this group. And now seems to be very sanguine. He's okay with it. But during the trials, as Sophia mentioned, a number of people have actually admitted, well, I didn't really believe it. It really wasn't, like Sidney Powell, for example, who is a QAnon influencer and is appearing at all of these QAnon, rallies, which they charge significantly, like $300, $400, $500 a ticket. So it's always a financial grift. Even Powell on the stand can't say that this is true. So I think that there is, a disconnect. Many of the people that believe in QAnon do not even know what's going on in Washington. Like, they're not watching what we're watching.
So, Sophia, I want to turn to you for a second, because your expertise is psychology. And I wouldn't be surprised if everyone who's watching this or listening has either a friend or a family member or both who have been caught up, either deeply involved in QAnon or are unwittingly spouting QAnon conspiracy theories. So my question is, and this is one of the things that really impressed me about your book, is that you both address this issue in what I consider a sensitive way, in being able to constructively engage with someone who is caught up in these delusions. So my question, Sophia, is what can we do? What can an individual do to help a person who's caught up in this?
Yeah, I think you're right. In fact, I know you're right. We did a study where we asked people whether they knew somebody personally who was a QAnon believer, and we were just stunned at the sheer number of people who reported that they knew somebody who was in QAnon, which was 85% of our participants. And out of this 85% who knew somebody, more than half, this person they knew was in their family. So it wasn't just, somebody they met online, or sometimes walk their dog with. It was somebody that they've known most of their lives who suddenly became a different person. So it can be very traumatizing to have somebody that you are used to thinking about one way, and all of a sudden this person starts saying things and maybe doing things that are completely alien. And in fact, families have broken up over this. Spouses left each other. Children were kicked out of their family homes, and brothers stopped talking to sisters, and so on, because one of these people believed QAnon and the other just couldn't deal with it. So it's a very pertinent question. And the best answer I can give, when people ask me, what do I do when a loved one starts talking about these QAnon beliefs of theirs? The best answer I have is not maybe the most satisfying, but it's the one that psychological research says it's the best one. And that is, don't argue with them on content. Don't tell them they're wrong to believe in lizard people. Don't tell them there is no cabal. Don't tell them that COVID vaccines are not actually tracking devices. Because when you do that, what happens is you put the person on the defensive, and you develop hostility, you grow polarization, they become, more against you than they were before. And even if you win that argument then and there, what happens psychologically is over time, after the argument, the person will come back to it again and again if they lost. And then they will develop new arguments that they didn't think of during your conversation, and they will end up thinking that you just tricked them and they were actually right all along. And they will believe even more what they believed originally. So they become even more entrenched. So one thing not to do is not to argue with people on the content. And one thing that does work, although it's not easy and it's not trivial to do it, but it is to build emotional connections with people. And the thing to understand about QAnon is a lot of people who came to these beliefs, they came to them out of loneliness and isolation and grievances and anger and fear and anxiety. And once they were in this QAnon rabbit hole, it became even more isolating for them because, one, they were spending all of their time doing this research online, connecting the dots and baking the crumbs, instead of socializing with people who were in their actual life. And second, of course, it doesn't help social connections when you come to a party, you come to a family gathering, and you start spewing this content. So even if they weren't horribly isolated before they became QAnon followers, chances are they became after. And so if somebody you love or know is a QAnon believer, the best bet is to try to maintain a connection, an open dialogue, and to tell them that you understand how they feel. You may not agree with them on exactly what they believe, but the feelings are relatable. We all can understand the anxiety about COVID. We can all understand, grievances about how the medical system in the United States has become not exactly always trustworthy and reliable, right? We can all share grievances about the government until the cows come home, right? So the emotional connection is always available, and capitalizing on it creates an opening. And so one day when that person, for whatever reason, feels like maybe they can have a conversation with an open mind, then this connection that you build becomes a conduit through which you can bring them back in.
It's
when
really
they're ready.
taking the long view, right?
Yeah. A lot of things in life are like
right.
that.
And
No quick fixes. Yeah.
and I'm sort of putting you on the spot here, both of you. Have you been able to, in a sense, put that into practice in the relationships that you have with people who believe some of this stuff?
We were actually really touched. Roseanne Boylan's brother-in-law contacted us. Someone had given him a copy of the book, and she was the other woman that was killed on January 6th. Not Ashley Babbitt, whose mother was also arrested today, but the woman who was crushed. And he reached out to Sophia and I, and he said, I read your book, and he said, I appreciate so much that the position you took was that my sister wasn't some evil, crazy person, but she thought she was doing the right thing. She thought she was helping children. And I think if we start from a position of Sophia and I are both opposed to child trafficking, we think it's very bad. We would like it to end. Like we would suggest is finding that there might be some areas of common belief. So for example, I found out that I have a cousin who believes in QAnon. So when we used to say in interviews that, there's probably someone in your family or in your network, and then I found out that I had a cousin that I don't talk to that believes in QAnon, I thought, well, wasn't that prescient? But you start with, I can appreciate, or I also agree with you on this point and this point. And, then you very slowly build a kind of rapport and trust so that the person doesn't feel attacked. And then what Sophia did in the last chapter, and I want to give her full credit for that, is she lists a series of questions and then she gives you the answer. And the reason that that's important is because that's the way you plant the seed of doubt, because you can ask the friend or family member the questions and you've got the answers. And if they're unable to answer those questions, now all of a sudden you're getting to the crux of the problem. Because with any conspiracy theory, there are inconsistencies that make no sense.
So, Sophia, what are some of those questions that we can ask our friends and families who are spouting this stuff?
Well, I think it's more what they can ask us, than what we can ask them. I think, as Mia said, we probably know somebody, and I do. One of my really dearest friends from back, when I was 11. I don't know if she would call herself QAnon, but she certainly believes a lot of these QAnon things. And I chose early on to just avoid that area of her, belief system. And what happened was, when COVID started hitting really close to home, she has 2 kids. She came to me with that anxiety. And I was really happy that she was open-minded enough to ask me what I would suggest, in terms of medical interventions, vaccines, and so on. Because up until that point, it seemed like she really wasn't open to it. And if I didn't maintain this bridge for us to be friends still, she would have had just the QAnon content to go with. So when she came to me and she asked me, so, what do you think about vaccines? Are they going to make my children infertile? Literally the question she asked, are they going to do this to my children? Then, I was able to, without really politicizing it or calling her crazy, to answer those questions and say, listen, we have now, good data. They're not going to do this. They're not going to do that. And in fact, it's a good idea to do this and that. And, I am very privileged that I was in that position. And the reason I was that I was there for her to ask me questions. And in answering them, I was being a friend. I wasn't lecturing her. I wasn't talking down to her. I wasn't there to make her feel bad and feel good that I'm so smart and I'm so educated and she's not.
Mia mentioned earlier that Sophia, that you mentioned, you talk about mindfulness. What role does mindfulness have? What is mindfulness, and what role can it have in helping someone in this situation?
Mindfulness can be a lot of things. It's a way of life. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of doing everything. It comes from a little bit from the Buddhist practice, but it's very secular. There are mindfulness programs that have nothing to do with any religion at all. And the idea is just you learn to live a little slower, to give yourself time to notice what you feel and what you think instead of immediately reacting, which is very often our pace of life is conducive to just going, just doing, we don't have a moment to slow down. We're all so busy and so important. And what happens when you don't give yourself a chance to pause and slow down is you react in ways that become progressively maladaptive. So the anxiety that we feel, makes us defensive, and we jump to conclusions about people and circumstances, and we engage in actions that were not necessarily in our best interests. And so too with, QAnon beliefs, we trace their origins in the book to this anxiety about COVID as a virus, and then anxiety that came from isolation. How long was that going to last? What was the society going to look like at the end of it? When was it going to, stop? And all of this very strong emotional turmoil pushed a lot of people into these QAnon rabbit holes where they were just getting very quick answers that, we're going to ease their anxiety right there. And instead, mindfulness suggests that, if we train ourselves in a mindful way of addressing situations that will come up sooner or later. We all live in the world is stressful. and we react to it. We are going to feel this anxiety, but we're going to be better able to handle it, better able to consider alternative solutions to the one that first comes to mind, and hopefully better able to arrive at a better life and better relationships and better actions for ourselves.
There, a couple of people have weighed in the chat with questions, and I want to take one of them full. The question is there anything that social media providers can do to address the problem with the QAnon and the conspiracy theories?
I think a report that came out yesterday, Alex Newhouse and his co-authors basically said that social media really played a massive role in January 6th and in dissemination of QAnon. And so we know that Facebook, had ample opportunities to either deplatform well-known QAnon influencers or even fix their algorithms. Interestingly enough, Reddit banned QAnon or many of the subreddits as early as 2018. And there was a very long lag between the rest of the companies. And we're seeing now back on Etsy or Amazon or some of the other platforms, the Q content is back. And so not only did they do a very poor job in moderation before, but it's almost like there's been no lessons learned and it's the Wild West again. And, Elon Musk owning Twitter has given a platform back to the very same people that Twitter deplatformed in 2020. So I really think that the social media companies, if they're not going to consider themselves news organizations and have to follow certain rules and regulations as a news organization, then certainly they're going to bear the responsibility as companies that are aiding and abetting either before or after the fact in crimes.
It doesn't sound like either of you are particularly hopeful about the future. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I think part of it is, and I wear two hats because I work with the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism. We are trying to make social media and the virtual world a safer space, but it becomes very difficult when one of the owners of the platform is spreading that same disinformation about Anthony Fauci or about vaccines or about, anything that's sort of QAnon adjacent. So I think that, the problem is now we're going to have at least 2 years of a Congress where these very squeaky wheels who promote QAnon content are going to have captured the Congress, because if it's only going to be between 5 and 1 votes to make Kevin McCarthy step down if he is eventually elected, then, we really do have the tail wagging the dog. It reminds me of in the Israeli Knesset system, where you have a very small percentage of ultra-Orthodox that are able to dictate to the majority, because without them being part of the coalition, you lose the government and then someone else has to be reelected. So I think in some ways we are facing the possibility of a very small number of fringe Republicans controlling the agenda and also excluding certain conversations or preventing votes. And that's what makes me nervous.
I want to ask each of you this question, and I'll start with you, Sophia. Have you, since the book came out in 2021, so my question is, have you experienced any personal blowback because of this book?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't call it blowback. We had some unpleasant interactions with some readers, but I think, that's not really anything to write home about. Mia?
Melissa Rain Lively in particular was
comes to mind.
What comes to mind? I'm naming names. I don't care. I think what happens is that a number of the people who were in QAnon are trying to get their own book deals. Some of the blowback we received actually was that, we did too good a job too quickly. So there was some blowback that way. But actually, most people have been extremely kind. The people who sort of felt that we had leapfrogged over their proverbial expertise were strange. Again, trying to find something wrong with the book or with us, me. But for the most part, the reviewers, the LA Review of Books reviewed the book on December 31st, and they were exceedingly kind. That their biggest criticism of us was that we were too impartial, and we're like, well, we're both academics, we kind of have to do that. Yeah. But we've been very lucky, and we're very grateful for the opportunity. Hopefully it's helped people. I know a number of people have written to us and said the book was really helpful. I have a brother-in-law or a mother-in-law or a parent or someone that they are going to use the book to try to help them out of this rabbit hole and back into the light. Because having been on these platforms for the research that Sophia and I do, I see the content that people who believe in QAnon see, and it is very distressing and it is horrific, and it would give you nightmares. And so I'm not surprised at all that these people are, becoming more anxious as a result of their participation, and we want to make them less anxious.
Yeah. So I want to ask this of both of you as well. Sophia, I'll start with you. What's next for you? What are you working on now?
Well, we're still working on disinformation. It's not just QAnon. We have a lot of very interesting disinformation coming out of Russia with respect to the war in Ukraine. That it's just so rich for exploration, and I'm very excited about that. Me and I are also on a very interesting project that will look at radicalization of members of the military and police forces in the United States. And of course, as ever, my work in policy and implementing mindfulness in counterterrorism through the UN platform is going strong.
Mm-hmm. Good. And Mia, what about you?
Well, we're very grateful to the Office of Naval Research, who has been supportive of this project. And so, as Sophia mentioned, we have this Insider Threat project with Ari Perliger at UMass Lowell at the Terrorism Center there. My new book has just been I guess signed under contract. And it's going to be a follow-up on my last book on women and terrorism, looking specifically at women and the jihad, called Veiled Threats. Because, of course, when Bombshell, my last book, came out, it was in 2011 and ISIS didn't exist yet, and Boko Haram didn't use women yet. So it's really going to be very different, because I had the opportunity to talk to people, to these women, and you get a very different view of how Boko Haram took over Nigeria, or tried to take over Nigeria, when you talk to the women of Boko Haram. So I'm looking forward to that. That'll probably be some point at the end of the year. So Sophia and I remain ever productive and busy bees, and hopefully we will have more articles and books in the future.
I want to give people an opportunity to get in contact with you. Mia, is there either an email or a website that people can use to get in touch with you? I can put it up on the screen if you. Whoops, I shouldn't put it up because there's nothing there yet. so let me type it in, and you tell me what to type.
Oh, feel free. People, if they have questions or follow up, or they want to know more, they can reach me at Georgia State University. So I'm mbloom3 at gsu.edu. And I answer all the questions, including, some of the more interesting ones from people who are believers, which happened after I did a C-SPAN where they had a fourth line. They usually have Democrats, Republicans, Independents. They added a fourth line for C-SPAN, QAnon. And there were a number of people who called in, and there were follow-up emails, and I will answer all your emails. And I'm very happy to hear from people what they think. And if they have feedback, we are really open to that as well.
Let's just make sure I've got it right on the screen there. It's mbloom, BLOOM3 at gsu.edu, correct?
Correct.
Excellent. And Sophia, how can people get in touch with you?
I typed my email in the chat, so you can just copy paste that.
Okay, excellent. We didn't have time ahead of time to work that out, but this has been fascinating. I loved the book, especially because it was so not only informative about the origins of QAnon, but I thought it was especially constructive in being able to help people understand the psychology of what's going on, and even more practical when it comes to engaging with family members and friends who are trapped. And it's basically a cult, I suppose, of really a, a belief system that is just delusional and not in touch with reality. But telling that to someone isn't necessarily going to be the solution. So this has been fascinating. We've been talking with Dr. Mia Bloom and Dr. Sophia Moskalenko, and I so appreciate you both for taking the time to talk.
Thank you for having us.